Well, good evening, everybody. It really is my pleasure to be here in all places in Bunbury, Western Australia. I didn't think I would ever come to Bunbury, Western Australia. But, these things, the fact is, we had the Truth of It live tour. Well, we call it the Truth of It live tour, but actually it's an elaborate lockdown evasion strategy, which I think about 3 of us have cooked up to great success. And as we leave each state, as each successive border falls, it works out really, really nicely. So we are leaving Western Australia later this week, so I apologise for whatever happens after that. I think the favour of God may travel with us, we trust. But ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. It really is humbling and it's an honour to have so many people everywhere we go to listen to these events. And I didn't actually realise, but standing just off stage over there, I saw that what I have to say tonight, it really is very much on the theme of what's being discussed already. I am talking about Salt and Light. I am talking about Western Australia in particular, and I hope to anchor it all around a question, which is what should we do? Now you say, what should we do about what? Well, the pressing moral issues of our time. I assume that's why you're here. I assume you are concerned about such things, that you take an interest in such things. And what I'm going to do is give you an autopsy of Western Australia to start with, to thoroughly depress you, and that is my specialty. And from that point, however, I hope to inspire you, to show you how we might think about these things well and act in the light of them. Now, some of you might not know this about me, but I was involved in the establishment of a group called the Human Rights Law Alliance just a few years ago. And HRLA, or the Alliance, is a law firm which is dedicated to helping people who get in trouble with the law for living out their faith. And you might say, well, you'd hope that such a service isn't necessary. And to be honest, I wasn't sure when it first started. But the fact is, it has been extremely busy ever since it began, and it continues to be busy today. It is, in fact, in the capable hands of a West Australian lawyer, John Steenhoff, who now has moved to Canberra to take up the role and to run that very capably. But it doesn't just get cases from WA, it gets cases from all over Australia. But there are cases in WA. For example, when the West Australian State Government declined our bookings for venues when we tried to come here, HRLA stepped in to help. Now, that was something that was justified under the basis that we didn't share the values of the West Australian State Government, or, as it said, the vast majority of Western Australians. Now, that's actually very concerning. And it's concerning because the places where you have governments that try to cancel people who disagree with them are not democracies. That is quite simply the mindset of what the Communist Chinese government might do. And I do wonder, where is the mindset of the person who writes that policy and thinks that's a good idea? I mean, who are they employing? Who is working here? It's a totalitarian mindset, and that's why it was concerning. Now, we're not too worried on the whole about whether people want to have us or not, but when it came to the government, that was a different story. Now, this is something I want to point out to you that is becoming a bit of a new normal for many Christians across the country. It's been fairly normal for us for a while, but someone's got to be the lightning rod. But it's becoming a new normal for many people across the country, many Christians, and I'm going to show you how. And when I start to do this, a lot of people, they say, oh, you're just playing the victim. Look, I will never be a victim because Jesus died for me. It's not possible. So we're not victims. No one in the room is a victim. Let's not get that mindset. But we need to tell the truth about what is happening so that we know how to respond well, okay? And that's what I'm going to do this evening. We knew that we would have some trouble on this tour. We knew that. We knew that we might have some protests. We knew that there would be some activist activity on our ticketing system, which there was. We knew we might end up with some venue challenges. It took a lot longer than we expected, to be honest, because this is fairly normal. We've been dealing with this over recent years quite a lot. I mean, I never forget. In fact, it's actually easier at the moment than it was a couple of years ago. I'll never forget I worked for ACL back in December 2016, previous managing director. And I'll never forget the car bombing of our office. An activist blew up a van in the car park and took out part of the office. That was the sort of situation we were in then. So it's actually alleviated just a bit. But, a bit of pressure is coming on now. Now, we knew this through the Human Rights Law Alliance as well. I said that the HRLA took cases from WA. For example, one of the cases that they're running at the moment, it's fairly long running, is the case of Byron and Cura. They're West Australians and they applied to become foster parents for children under the age of 5 to provide them with respite care on weekends and so forth while they're between foster homes. That is a critical, urgent need in Western Australia. Now, they had to go through a selection process for that, and they filled out all kinds of surveys, and they knocked it out of the park on every selection criteria. They were absolutely front and centre, no problems. Until, of course, they had to do a quiz on the SOGI issue, sexual orientation, gender identity, and they were asked very particular questions about their faith convictions on these subjects. And they filled it out faithfully, and it was perfectly, there was nothing surprising in it. There was nothing nasty in it. It was just faithful Christian belief on the subjects at hand. And then they were declined. Now, the thing is, though, they made a very good point when they were filling it out. They said, well, we've applied to be respite carers for children under the age of 5, so it's hardly likely to apply, which is a good point, right? However, on that basis, they were declined to become foster carers because they were told that their home was not safe for children. Jason is a West Australian-based photographer that we helped. Jason was in a situation where an old school friend of his decided to reach out to him to take some family photos. The lady in question was lesbian by identity, but it wasn't an issue. Jason wasn't going to wasn't declining service. It wasn't one of those kinds of cases at all. But what happened was that in the course of the negotiations, Jason shared his faith with this lady and explained to her what he believed. And he did so in quite a lovely way. I read the messages, and it was perfectly reasonable what he said. But he was taken to the State Administrative Tribunal for what he said, because the allegation was made that he had put some kind of condition on his service on the basis of someone's identity. I don't know what the condition would have been if that had actually gone to court. It would have been quite an argument to make. Fortunately, it was settled, or it was dropped after it became quite public. But that was Jason's situation. But also, there's a guy called Ian who now lives in WA, and we helped Ian when he posted on the Alice Springs community notice board, because he was in Alice Springs at the time. He was a school teacher, and he was put under discipline by the Department of Education because he put posts on the Alice Springs community notice board around the same-sex marriage time, and there were lots of posts on there supporting it, and he put a post up there saying, this is why I don't support it. Again, it was reasonable, it wasn't inflammatory, it wasn't off message or anything like that, and he was put under discipline by the Department of Education. Now, these sorts of cases are pretty normal. They're common. There's a bit of a hotline to HRLA that people ring up with employment issues with their academic institutions, with issues with their accreditations. We've had doctors ring. The medical board is on a bit of an ideological rampage at the moment and hunting down all sorts of people with conservative opinions and having a go at them and saying they're not safe for their patients. That sort of language comes up a lot. But the laws, the legal mechanisms that make this possible are also getting more muscular. It's not just that there's activists at work, there's laws that are passing to make it easier. And one of the ones that's relevant to you in Western Australia is this law, which is horrifically named, conversion therapy legislation. I mean, as soon as you say conversion therapy, everyone has a freak out and thinks that you're talking about something terrible. Well, here's the reality. Conversion therapy is not happening in Western Australia, okay? Now, there might be one guy somewhere with a shingle out, I don't know. But basically, it's not happening. It's not a Christian idea that you can therapyize someone into conversion or anything like that. That's not the situation at all. But what this law does is it uses that name as a cover so that people don't have the guts to speak against it. And it uses that name as a cover to do all sorts of other things. The other things include, as Peter told you, for example, it actually makes it legally fraught for a parent to speak to their child about issues of gender identity if the child claims to have gender dysphoria or identify as the other. It could be a 10-year-old, an 11-year-old, a 12-year-old. They could have gone to school. They could have heard about all the stuff that they talk about at school with gender bending and all the rest of it. And if the parent talks to the child and says, well, even if they say, well, let's wait and see. Let's just wait and see, which is the way that the large part of the medical profession deals with this issue and has dealt with it up until now, that could be a criminal act. That could be a criminal act. Now, it's not just me saying this. We have better lawyers than me writing submissions into the Victorian state government when they passed this law. You had the Victorian Law Institute oppose the law, and they are not conservative, let me tell you that. You had the AMA of Victoria oppose the law. So this is not a small thing. It's quite a big deal, and I did a video where I just go through the legislation line by line and show what it plainly says, which includes this. For example, the legislation also, and I think this is an Australian first, the legislation in the Victorian scenario, it specifically names prayer as a potential criminal offence. I don't think that's ever happened before. No, it definitely hasn't. But if you pray for someone, even by request, and your prayer relates in any way to their gender identity or their sexual orientation or anything like that, you could be committing a criminal act. Again, if you're a pastor and you speak on these issues, some of my talks, if I say God's will for a person's life is, if I'm a man, God's will for my life is either to remain single in a minority of cases or get married to a woman for the rest of my life. That is inducing people to suppress their sexual orientation because I'm saying God's approval rests on this through the statements that I'm making. That could be a criminal act. And if someone goes and says that harmed me, and that's all you need, and the harm could be temporary mental discomfort in the definition, then that could be an imprisonable offence. And you say, no, that's never going to happen. Well, the law says it could happen. And I know a few activists who would love nothing more than to try and do that. Because what the law actually does in effect is it potentially criminalises a whole side of the debate, right down to speech. In fact, the explanatory memorandum of the bill specifically says that conversations can be in breach of the law. Conversations with community leaders, i.e. pastors. That's the conversion therapy legislation. So they say conversion therapy does rather a lot more. And I've often, anyway, that's the situation with that. There's also a number of social policies changing from which it's harder for Christians to opt out. You find, for example, in abortion legislation, conscientious objectors don't really get out of it. If somebody feels like they can't perform abortions, they have to, under law, refer to somebody who definitely will. Now, that's not really much of a break in the chain, is it? So there's no respect for the conscientious objection of people who feel they can't do this, which wouldn't be too hard to legislate. In fact, there's been a case out of Victoria on that it's always Victoria, isn't it? Not always, but often. There's been a case out of Victoria on this very matter where a doctor had a couple come to him for a late-term abortion because the child was a girl. And he thought that was terrible because the child was viable at the time. And so he reported it. But silly him, they didn't go after the couple, they went after him because he had declined, and he had declined to refer, and that was illegal. You also see difficulties around euthanasia as well, for people who say, well, I can't kill someone. I just can't do that. I draw the line there. And plenty of Christians are in that situation, because it is wrong, by the way, just in case you needed me to tell you. You can't kill someone. But again, you've got to give a leaflet with the information that sends the person to the right place. All of these things, there's this sort of muscularizing of so much stuff. Yeah, look, I was actually going to make a comment about COVID, but in the interest of time, I won't. You can ask me about it in the Q&A. Where is it going to end? That's the question. And I don't know quite where it's going to end. But I'll tell you what, now that I've got you depressed, I want to go back to the original question. What can we do? What can we do? And the answer is it depends. Because there's two kinds of problems which demand two kinds of answers. First, there's problems we can do something about that are in our control to some degree. But there's also plenty of problems that are out of our control, genuinely, and about which we can do nothing. And we need to distinguish the two. Because if you vex your soul over those things concerning which you can do nothing about, and you let them weigh you down, you will lose your peace. You will lose your joy. You'll be defeated by misery and anxiety. And this is the reason I was going to mention COVID, is because there are some people who are letting it drive them crazy. They really are. Now, I've got my issues with what's going on, I really do. But there's some of that stuff that is just out. It's global, right? There's a big global thing happening here, and there's lots of angles from which people are fearful. There's fear of the disease, there's fear of the policy response, there's fear of governments, there's fear of mandatory vaccinations, all of those things. I understand all that. But the truth is, there's a crucial sense in which it's not in our control. And what are we going to do? Vex our soul until we lose our peace and joy and go practically frantic on Facebook? Come on, we've got to distinguish between what we can do and what we cannot do. And I want to deal firstly with the things that we cannot do, the things we cannot control. And I mentioned one of them. Another one is just the big social trends that are going on all around us at the moment. There's a few of those. You think of the education system and all the stuff that just keeps heaping into that. A lot of that is part of a huge, big trend all around us. And there's a huge trend there which you can't snap your fingers and fix tomorrow. That thing is more complex. Or indeed, you could look at something like Afghanistan, just for an obvious example. What are you going to do about Afghanistan? It's challenging, right? There's nothing I can do today about Afghanistan. There are things that are out of our control. Do you know, there's a surprising source of inspiration for some of these things that are out of our control. And I don't think inspiration and the word Job are usually put together. But it inspires me to think about these things well, because he was a man who had to wrestle with things that were beyond his control. And they didn't just look and feel ominous. They impacted him very personally in very profound ways. They'd really come home to roost in his life. And you all know the story. There's a heavenly meeting with God and Satan, and God points out Job's incredible testimony and says, he's a righteous and blameless man, the finest man of all the men in the East, it says. So Job was a good guy. And Satan says, yeah, but if only he says, you put a hedge about him, you've made him prosper. He says, if only you'll let me at him. He says, he will certainly curse you to your face, are the words that he uses. And so God says, okay, but don't lay a finger on him personally, but do anything else. And so off he goes. And you get that terrible passage where Job's sitting there one day minding his business and a messenger shows up. And the messenger says to him, hey, you know what? There was ploughing going on and the Sabaeans attacked and took all your donkeys and all of your oxen and killed the servants, and I'm the only survivor. And then the second servant shows up while he's still speaking and says, well, actually, the fire of God just fell from heaven and it burned up the sheep and it burned up the servants and they're all dead and I've escaped to tell you. And while he's still speaking, another guy comes along and he says, the Chaldeans formed 3 units, made a raid on the camels and took them and killed all your servants, and I alone have escaped to tell you. And while he's still speaking, another guy comes along and says, actually, a great big wind just whipped up for no reason and blew the house down and all your 10 kids are dead. And I'm the only one who's escaped to tell you. Now, here's a guy who had to deal with things that were out of his control, and they're a little more serious even than some of the things we're talking about this evening. But here's the question, right, that we need to figure out. First of all, who was in control if it wasn't Job? Who was in control? Because behind Job's calamity are the Chaldeans and the Sabaeans and the cyclone and a raging fire, all on the same day. But behind the Chaldeans and the Sabaeans and the fire and the wind, well, we know it was Satan, right? And the first lesson is this: Satan does actually have great power. The forces of evil are very real and they're very strong. These forces are not only seen in human nature, in sinful people, but they are also seen in the systems of our world, even on a national and a global scale. Now, people instinctively believe that there's some truth in this. I say Satan and evil, and they say, well, you're a kook. But everyone believes this. Why else do progressives and Marxists and these types, why do they go on about systemic oppression, systemic racism, systems? They believe that there's systemic evil. They all believe that. They just misunderstand what it is. And they also underestimate human evil and the capacity of the human heart for sin, including their own. I mean, that's the human condition. But we know something different. The Bible teaches this very clearly. In 1 John 5:19, it says, we know that we're of God and the whole world lies in the evil one. That's powerful words. That there is unseen and supernatural power that fights for control, and it is evil. In John's Gospel, 3 times, Jesus calls Satan the ruler of this world. He operates through people and he operates through the systems of the world. In Ephesians 6:12, for our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. You know, behind the powers of this world is the system of evil trying to gain a foothold. I was in Shanghai a number of years ago, which was really interesting. I'm not just a tall man in Shanghai. I'm a novelty giant. And while I was in Shanghai, I walked into a clothing shop and I was looking around, just because I was bored. And then I saw a bloke come out from the clothing rack. He sort of appeared through the clothes. And he walked off. And I thought, like lots of shops in Shanghai, it must have a back room somewhere with all the good stuff. And so I sort of, parted through, walked out the back, and I realized I wasn't in a clothing shop anymore. I had come into an establishment of ill repute, I shall call it. And lucky I wasn't the MD of the ACL at the time. I would have run real fast, but no, I did run real fast. I thought, whoop, mistake, and I realized something. I realized that shop was a front for something else. And we're all familiar with that concept of something being a front for something else. Maybe it's a business that's actually a front for some money laundering. Or maybe it's an establishment that's a front for organised crime. Here's something really true. Very often, the systems of power in our world are a front for the forces of evil. That is true. And certainly when I first got into politics 7 odd years ago, it hit me like a freight train. I often wonder, anyone who spent any significant amount of time in Canberra, it's a certain kind of place. It is the most irreligious city in the country. And that's factually true. And I just think that can't be a mistake, can it now? Very often it's these places of power. And this all came to the national consciousness recently with that young woman that was tragically raped in the minister's office. And then all this other stuff started to bubble up of all the naughty things going on, all the darkness that's in Parliament House. Let me tell you, we all know it's all true and far more that just touched the surface. Now, this is the nature of these systems of power. Like a moth to the light, they do attract evil intent. They do attract evil intent. Now, I want to ask a question. If behind Job's troubles were the Chaldeans and the Sabaeans and the wind and the fire, and behind the Chaldeans and the Sabaeans and the wind and the fire was Satan, who was behind Satan? Hey, that's right. In Albany, they were way more onto it. There must be different theology around here. But here's the reality, right? And this is at first confronting. It's hard to get your head around. But the fact is, it's comforting. Because if God was not always ultimately in control, then evil would serve its own purposes, its own ends, and have its own way. And I'll tell you this, it might be out of your control, but it's not out of his. And it will never, ever, 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 ever ultimately be able to serve its own ends. One of the proofs of that in the Bible is Joseph's story, and he's got incredible perspective in Genesis 50:20, where Joseph says to his brother, after all the evil they did to him, he says, well, what you meant for evil, he says, and here's the miracle, God used it for good. And it really was evil, and God didn't author it, but ultimately it submitted to God's purposes anyway. And Ephesians 1:11 teaches the same thing, and I mentioned this up in Perth, that all things submit to the counsel of his will in Ephesians 1:11. And that includes in the Bible the falling of a sparrow, the rolling of a dice. It includes the installation of kings, the decision in the hearts of kings. The forces of evil are real and we must take them seriously. And it does make us sober-minded and careful. And it also makes us prayerful. I have a friend who used to say, you know what, he said, if you can't control something or, you're facing some issue, he says, go above their head. Pray. And it makes us prayerful. And it also makes me very careful. There are times I'm not quite sure where to step. And you're sort of praying about every step, like a crooked plank over a shark-infested water. The fact is there's a lot of unseen stuff out there. But listen, this is the point. That may be true, but none of this would be happening in the world if God was not allowing it to happen. And it must be allowed for a reason. It must be. You say, what's the reason? I haven't a clue. And that's okay. It's okay that I don't have a clue because Job cried out in the pit of his despair, why in the world is this happening? And the answer really to that question is no. You've asked the wrong question. Because the reason wasn't in this world at all. The reason, and Job never saw this, we get this unique behind the curtain perspective at the start. Job never saw that the reason actually for what was going on in the first instance was in heaven. And he never got to see that. It was truly beyond him from start to finish. It was outside of his sight, his hearing, his touch, and his smell. It was in another realm. And sometimes things happen that are in the purpose and plan of God, and they're not even seen to us here on earth. And a lot of people get very angry about this. I recently did a segment in The Truth of It on high-profile deconverters, people who are high-profile Christians who then renounce their faith. And there was a common theme in all of their stories. They were all very angry that they didn't know the mind of God. They were angry that they didn't know why evil existed in the world, why bad things happened. I mean, what makes us think we would even understand the answer? I mean, our synapses might blow up. It's clearly not told to us. But they were also really angry about the fact that, why doesn't God do things their way? Or why are God's laws written like this? And why can't I just do what I want in this area? They were at war with the fact that they weren't God. They were at war with the fact that they were creatures. And sometimes we've got to remember that we are of the dust. We are creatures. And there will always be, and everyone, Christian or non-Christian, lives with mystery in their life. They live with unknowns. They live with whys and unanswered questions. Well, the Christian knows why there's a mystery. Because there are things about God in another realm that you will never understand. But here's the thing. The reason might be unknown, and Job had to face that in the face. God might truly be in control. So what is the answer? And really for Job, he realized that he found the answer when he didn't want the answer anymore. He prayed to God for many chapters. And then blow me down, God showed up. And he sat down and unleashed a volley of 77 questions non-stop, none of which Job could hope to answer. And Job realized who had the power, and he realized who had the wisdom, and he realized who had the plan. And he realized that regardless of everything, his trust was not misplaced. And he put his hand on his mouth and he effectively said, I have no questions anymore. Those questions I thought I had, I don't have them. And he never got an answer, and that was fine. And he returned to what he said right at the start, which was, though he slay me, I will trust him. It's a bit like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fire. You read where they say, our God is able to deliver us. And they go, but if not, then we trust him anyway. Their trust is not misplaced. And we are called to face so many things that we cannot control. But we must know, all of us, that our trust is not misplaced. Jesus did say it is not given to you to know the times or the seasons that the Father has set by his authority. There's a mystery here, and you will find yourself perplexing over what's going on in these big realms. But the life of faith is the life that looks really to God and trusts him, even in the things we cannot see. One of the best definitions of faith I ever heard, or descriptions is probably the best descriptions of faith I ever heard, was that faith looks to God. It doesn't matter what context that word is used in. It doesn't matter what particular kind of faith it's talking about. It always includes an element of looking to God. But of course, we can answer a question now about, what ultimately was the point of all that happened to Job? Well, for starters, the book of Job itself. How significant do you suppose that book has been to hundreds of millions more people throughout the eons of the centuries that have passed? How many people's faith do you think it's strengthened? How many answers do you think it's supplied? Enormous, right? Again, Job never saw that, but his trust was not misplaced. His story was used. But here's another question I want to leave us with on this particular point. Who was it that suffered more than Job? The answer is Jesus suffered more than Job. And the thing we must always remember is that we're never asked to deal with any more than Christ himself ever dealt with. He it was who sweated blood at the very prospect of what was to happen to him. He it was who was condemned to death by the people who he created. John says he came to his own creatures, and his own creatures did not receive him, and they did not know him. And they said, away with him. We won't have this man to rule over us. And he was put to death by the most brutal means. Not only that, but he was also cursed by God himself. And it doesn't matter how far down things go. It doesn't matter how far down they go for us. He went further. But also, here's another point to remember. That was the darkest hour of all of human history to this point in time. Nothing worse has ever happened on the face of the planet than that. And probably the forces of evil were thinking they'd won. But the truth is that that was the greatest victory that the cosmos has ever known, bar none, in that moment. And so do you think, And the question I ask then, is our trust misplaced? Remember, they mocked him on the cross and said, well, he trusted in God. Let him deliver him. Well, God did deliver him, just not in the way they expected. His trust was not misplaced. Ours is not misplaced either. Let me just make these 2 points real fast. One, at the resolution of Job's issue, he was at peace. And it goes back to my original point. What do you do about the things that are out of your control? Trust in God and have peace in that. It's so important that our peace is not robbed of us and taken away. It's so important that our joy does not go. I meet a lot of people in politics, they're not very joyful. They've been defeated because they've lost that vertical perspective and they've let it overwhelm them. The first thing we must do about those things out of our control is not be defeated by them. And the second thing we must do, and if we really see that they're out of our control, but they are in someone else's control, we will pray about them. I often say in these talks, all through the Bible, you see so many occasions when the world goes to custard, and then God moves through one person who's ready to be used, and he changes things. But a piece that I miss out, of course, which I sort of thought of when I was preparing this, was that very often it's in response to prayer. It's in response to prayer. You think of Nehemiah, God's people in such a terrible state, off in exile, the temple destroyed. How did all of his commissioning and story begin? He prayed. And it took a little while, and his prayer was answered. Or you think of someone like Hannah. How was Israel delivered by Samuel? It all started with a prayer. It started with a prayer of his mum. And God heard it and answered. And there's often that verse quoted, and people say sometimes it's out of context, but it makes a really important point. If my people humble themselves and pray, we know the verse, right? I will hear from heaven, and repent of their sins, I will hear from heaven and heal their land, etc. The most important word is if. If they will. And I think that in times like these, I think if something like COVID, this global disaster, is not enough to drive the people of God to prayer, then nothing is. And that is really how we should be responding. Not necessarily that it will go away, but that God's will be done, and as the Apostle Paul would have prayed, that it would all work out for the furtherance of the gospel. That is the most important thing. That is how we think about those things over which we have no control. Sometimes I forget to do it and people always come up and say, hey! But I can reveal a secret to you all, which I've never done. On this piece of paper, it just says, nice catch. So, I don't know if anyone actually caught it there. Let me, much more briefly, deal with this point. Otherwise, we'll have no time for Q&A. Let me deal with this point. What is it that we do about those things where we can respond? And I particularly want to single out issues where it is happening on account of righteousness. What do I mean by that? Well, just think of it like this. The Christian parent facing the conversion therapy laws that I talked about. Or the Christian foster parent facing the system. Or the Christian citizen facing the state when they're demanded to do something they don't want to do, like don't pray for that person. Well, you probably should pray for that person. Christian employee, facing HR when something goes wrong, when something's been said and there's been a complaint lodged. What about these situations? Well, the first thing we need to understand is that Jesus thought of this before you did. And he said something very interesting about it. In that opening monologue, I detected a little bit of depression, which is the point. But this is what Jesus said when he thought about this. He said, "Blessed are the persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." In other words, he said there's a blessing here. Perk up. There's a blessing. I mean, do we believe that? And he goes on and doubles down. He says, "Rejoice and be glad, for great is your reward in heaven." And I think it's very sad to see Christians living for this life. Christians living like this, like they've got blinkers on. And they're worried about all that's going on around them and the pressures of other people and the pressures of the institutions and all this kind of stuff. But the plumb line for your life, the basic guiding post for your life should be founded in the next life. And what you do daily should be defined by the next life. Jesus said, if you're making treasure on earth, and it's nice to make treasure on earth. It's fun. But here's the reality. It's all going to go. Moth will come in and eat it. Rust will get in and rust it, as he says. He says, thieves will break in and steal it. He says, the only lasting thing is the well done, good and faithful servant and what comes next. And we must never forget that. And people get overwhelmed in these moments and they forget where their anchor post is supposed to be. That is for context every day. Some people do turn to me at this point, because I've spoken on Matthew 5 before, and they say, Martyn, but it's not persecution. Steady on, steady on. Persecution is the lions eating you and, lit up as torches in Nero's day. Fair enough. I'm not going to take that away from anyone who's been through that experience. But I want to make it very clear. Jesus defines his terms. He says, if they revile you, if they're angrily disgusted with you, if they insult you, if they speak all kinds of evil against you falsely for my sake. Now, what does he mean by revile, angry, disgust? Well, how's this? Bigot? Hater? Homophobe? We know that's not true, don't we? It's just not true. In fact, it couldn't be possibly more wrong. And yet there you have it. That's the zeitgeist. That's the belief of our day. I think he is thinking about these things. I really do. Actually, it's getting harder and harder. I was actually following a live feed discussion thread during the Olympics because I was in Tasmania, biding my time to get over the Berlin Wall to come into WA. And I watched TV for the first time in at least 8 years. Can you believe that? And I turned on the Olympics, and I don't know if that's a badge of honor or if it's weird, actually. But I turned on the Olympics, and it was interesting. I was watching this live feed discussion thing of the Olympics, and you remember Nicola McDermott? Was that her name? The high jumper that got silver. And of course, she was obviously a Christian, and she was there with her journal with the cross. Honestly, the anti-Christian commentary just vomiting out of these people for minutes. They just couldn't let it go. And I thought, yeah, wow, okay. This is how so many people think about Christians. Well, Jesus said, well, take heart on this as well, because they persecuted the prophets who were before you. They had the same attitude. Here's an important thing. It's a feature, not a bug in the Christian life. It's really important to understand. When we do the download, we get a lot of young people come along, and one of the biggest pressing concerns for them, because they're just starting to realize they're not that popular in their beliefs, particularly at university and places like that. Fair enough, right? And the concern is, but how can everyone love me? How can I say it so that it doesn't land like a dead fish? How can I say it so that they all continue to be my friend? Oh, I'm sorry, it's a feature, not a bug. They're not all going to like you. Truth makes its own enemies. Jesus would never have said, for righteousness' sake, if this stuff didn't happen for righteousness' sake. Now, that doesn't mean be a jerk, of course. That's a whole other discussion. So don't. But my point is, you will never ultimately get there, because it is the fact, the truth, that makes the enemy so often. Now, I just want to be clear. Jesus saw this as situation normal. It comes out so clearly in all that he said, especially in John's Gospel. But he describes the Christian character in the Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes, and his next statement is, blessed are the persecuted. He's thinking this is normal. There's two things he calls us to do. Two things. Number one, and these are what we can do. Number one, he says, be salt. Now, what does that mean? The thing about the salt is it's got to keep its taste. How does salt lose its taste? Salt loses its taste by reason of moisture compromising it. In other words, the environment it's sitting in gets into it. And so he's saying when you're feeling the pressure, the most important thing to do is do not compromise on the things that matter. And that begins with your Christian character. He says this very thing in Luke's gospel in the midst of him saying, if your right hand offends, you cut it off. If your right eye offends, you pull it out. He's not really saying cut your hands off. What he is saying is get serious about sin in your life. Very serious. Get serious about holiness, because you're living in a putrid world that seeks to corrupt you, and its standards are not God's standards, and they are not holy. And I think what we have to do as Christians first and foremost, if we're to abide by this salt metaphor, and it comes before being light, it comes before the work of God going forward in the world so people glorify God, which is the next 2 points he makes. But first, he's talked about character in the Beatitudes, and now he says don't compromise, and it starts in here. And this is why, if those of you who are watching the Perth live stream, this is why I touched on the subject of what we're putting into our brains and through our eyes. There's so many Christian people who are allowing things to happen on screens in their lounge rooms that they wouldn't allow to happen in their lounge rooms otherwise. And it's compromising them. And it's numbing you to sin and evil. And it's making you weak. And it's wrong, wrong, wrong. We have to start with making sure that we in our own hearts are not compromised. And that we are getting serious about sin in our lives. We must. Now people say, oh, but it's there for artistic value. And I say, well, that means you're being entertained by it. It's worse, not better. Okay? It starts there. And I make that point hard because I do believe that so much of what we want for the world starts with the people of God. And if we want the world to revive, if we want people to be changed in the world, we got to change. And we got to be the people God can use to make that change. And I tell you, light shines light. A dim light shines a dim light. A light that's gone out shines no light. Really, the nature of the thing itself is so often what creates its effect. And that is true with salt, no compromise. But of course, it doesn't just mean that. It means in actions publicly as well. For example, I think of that law, don't pray. Well, what's a person going to do if they get asked to pray about such a thing for such a person? The answer is you've got to pretend the law doesn't exist at that point. You've got to pray for them. Obey God, not men. There's not many laws in this country where that clash happens, but that is one of them where it's very, very clear. We've got to make sure we're not bending to these standards. We've got to, in fact, make sure that we are a Daniel. Daniel knew that he couldn't plan his life better than God could. He knew that he couldn't be pragmatic and practical and figure out how to generate the right outcomes. He knew when his day of testing came, when they said, compromise, whether it was his prayer, whether it was his eating of the king's food, all these things. What did he do? He said, no, I will do the right thing today. I won't compromise even in Babylon, and God will take care of tomorrow. And so he did. It's the story of Daniel's life. Didn't hurt him, did it? He served 5 kings. I'm not saying that's definitely going to happen, but that's the reality. Salt, no compromise. Here's the second thing. The second thing we can do. The last thing we can do. Be light. Be light. In other words, be visible. Don't be under a basket. And this is a big challenge. The thing about being a Christian is you can hide. There's nothing really, hopefully you look like a relatively nice person. But the fact is you don't have to reveal who you are. That ship has sailed for me, let me tell you. But I didn't realize how I got away with it until I got the job with ACL, because people will ask you early on in the conversation, what do? You've got to reveal, right? You've got to say. But see, that's a good thing. I have a friend, actually, and he said to me, he said, my pastor was saying a good thing the other day. He said, you should introduce yourself as a Christian. I'm not saying in a weird, awkward way, be like, hey, I'm Martyn, I'm a Christian. But I do mean it should lead. It should lead in how you interact with the world. You shouldn't be in a workplace where they don't know. You shouldn't be in a university course where they don't know. People should know. Because visibility, now the problem is if you're visible, you've got to live like it, right? That's the challenge. Because the point is, if you are visible and if you're salty, you've got to make a difference in people's lives. People will ask you, if you are different, they will ask you. And you will get opportunities. And if you think, well, I never get any opportunities, well, pray for some opportunities. And they will come, I can tell you from experience. Or create some. Maybe do say, I'm Martyn and I'm a Christian. Not Martyn, whatever your name is. And see what happens. They might not pick it up, they might drop it. But visibility is so crucial, because if you are visible, then people know what makes you tick. They know why you are the way you are. And you can don't get too keen about what you can accomplish. Sometimes you just accomplish something with someone. You're going to change everyone's worldview in a single conversation. That's a big mistake we make, right? We think we'll have a conversation with someone and they'll just say, wow, you're right, blow me down. It doesn't usually happen that way. You might get to loosen one of the bolts, right? Good, the light's got to be on to loosen one of the bolts. Or you might be given an opportunity to put a rock in their shoe, as a friend of mine used to say. That's something that makes them think, You just never know. And I will say, I mean, I don't want to, I'm always mindful talking about these things. It's not us versus LGBT. But I do want to say this about the LGBT community, is they've done this brilliantly. Visibility. Brilliant, right? Cracking strategy. And everybody knows someone from the LGBT community. I'm sure most of us here do. But the thing is, when you do the surveys and you say to people, do you know a serious Christian, the numbers don't stack up. People say no when they surely do, because there's so many of them. A huge number of people, but the light's got to be on. And if we do all of that, the work of God will advance. Do you notice we started this section about persecution, it was, where you're on the back foot? All of a sudden we're walking the other way. Jesus says they will see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. So he closes out. Now he doesn't say they might, or he doesn't say make it so. He says they will. If you're salt and light, they will see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. Sometimes the noise and the negativity is very loud. I've certainly found that. And we can think that that's all there is. But let me tell you, if you're salt and light, the good stuff is happening. But it usually happens very quietly. I've been so blessed, particularly through this tour, to meet people who come up to you and say, this is how I've been impacted. And you go, oh, good stuff is happening in the world. And you get the quiet stories whispered in your ear. It is happening. Jesus said that it would happen. And I want to finish with this. Note what is the ultimate goal. We can't lose this, even in the political sphere. The ultimate goal is that people would glorify God. The ultimate goal is the changing of hearts, the restoration of souls, God's glory. We're not here just to do good things for the sake of doing good things. Well done, good and faithful servant, for pretending, deliberately not mentioning Jesus or the Bible every time you spoke, and just doing good things for the sake of it and letting people win the whole world and lose their soul. I don't think that's how it's going to go. The reality is that ultimately we must never forget that the final destination that God desires for every single person is that they would know Christ. And we need to be salt and light to that end. To that end. And so we must never hide the true reality of that in our lives so that it may transform other lives on the same basis. There's all kinds of ways in which people are drawn into that. And that's why we do so many things in so many public places. But what's the ultimate goal that we've always got in the back of our head? It is Christ, and it is that people would come to know him. I'm Martyn Iles, and that was the truth of it. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.